around us. Thank you.
Dr. David Clark.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to build on some of those comments made by Dr. Kennedy Graham. There was much in Dr. Smith's speech prior to it which was poppycock, and I think there was not enough time for Dr. Graham to constructively add to the debate and to address all of the nonsense raised by Dr. Smith. Dr. Smith, in his contribution, said that the desire was to address GHG, greenhouse gas emissions, through an expansion of the scheme. Now, this is a lofty way of phrasing things, but it doesn't sit well with the facts, because we know, and the government estimates, that this legislation will cost $328 million. It is legislation that is increasing the taxpayer cost because those costs are not being met by polluters. So the facts don't quite line up with the rhetoric, and that's not unusual from this government. But it is unfortunate, because here we have a serious issue that needs addressing and a government that is scurrying from it as fast as it can. Dr. Smith raised the issue of emissions increasing between 2000 and 2008 in a dramatic way. Emissions certainly did increase, and I guess that's something this government hasn't had to grapple with, because they at this stage are largely coincident with economic growth, and we know that this national government has the worst economic record of any government in the last 50 years. That's the worst economic record of any government in the last 50 years, Mr. Macleay. And so they have not had to deal with this issue of economic growth and how and to what extent one can decouple growth from emissions. Certainly the last Labor government consented significant amount of renewable energy, some of which is now coming on stream. It was the Labor government that introduced the emissions trading scheme with the support of the Green Party into this Parliament that has seen at least some response to climate change, a response that was not particularly forthcoming before it was tackled by the Labor government. And that scheme, I have to say, was a fairly modest one. And I think all members who supported it would acknowledge that it was ambitious in including all sectors and all gases, but that it started in a modest way. Its aim was not to put businesses out of business. Its aim was to shape the way in which future investment decisions were made, so that businesses would make their decisions based upon an understanding that there would be a carbon price in future. And that decision, that framework, is in fact the subject of one of the supplementary audit papers that I wish to discuss as I get into my address to this House. One in the name of Moana Maki, that talks about the possibility of having New Zealand-based units to ensure that there is actually a reasonable price of carbon, so that future investment decisions are made in a way that is in New Zealand's long-term interest, not in the interests of the next couple of years, the economic returns in the short term, so much as in the longer term. We know that New Zealand's products encapsulate or capture a higher premium price in the market because we have an environmentally friendly reputation. That reputation is under threat. That reputation is currently under threat. As New Zealand waters down this legislation, we will no longer be able to attain the same premium prices in the market. When this scheme was introduced, we in the Labor Party calculated that it would put an additional couple of cents cost on a block of butter. A couple of cents. But that couple of cents would go toward offsetting the emissions, and it would also help to ensure that those products were seen to be on the right side of the equation. Mr Ardern would like to see us wind the legislation back further, but it can't be done. This legislation that's being put through will ensure that the subsidy to farmers goes out indefinitely. The farming industry, which proudly claimed itself to be subsidy-free in the 80s, now is faced with the prospect of being heavily subsidised indefinitely. And the national government is ensuring that polluters are subsidised and ensuring that those farmers, Mr Chair,
David Clark,
that those farmers who are taking measures to reduce greenhouse gas emissions through good farming practices are not encouraged. Mr Ardern doesn't want to see those good farmers encouraged. He wants to encourage the worst farmers to continue doing what they're doing, and those farmers who are making changes in their farming practices, who are putting modern farming practices in place, not to be encouraged. So we know that nitrogen, the use of nitrogen on farms can be changed according to best practice to reduce emissions. Oh, it's all done, says Mr Ardern. He's well ahead of most of New Zealand on this issue. I will concentrate back on my speech rather than take too much more wisdom from that member on this matter. There is, of course, this prospect of losing our premium in the market. I'll come back to the point, which at all costs must be avoided, because New Zealand needs a smart, safe, business-friendly future, not a future that is tied to the worst parts of our economy in terms of those who are the greatest offenders in terms of emissions, but to one that rewards good farming practices and advances in clean, green-friendly, climate-friendly businesses. Now, the studies that Dr Smith referred to in his address, I have to point out, that talked about lower emissions with New Zealand stock, were commissioned under the Labour government, so there's a rich irony in him claiming that point. And there's also a point that needs to be addressed when he says which countries are doing more than New Zealand. Well, most countries. New Zealand's per capita emissions are embarrassingly high. If New Zealand, with its renewable resources, with its rich renewable resources, cannot address climate change, it is ridiculous to expect other nations to attempt to do so. New Zealand can, at lowest costs, address this issue, and so it's incumbent upon us to take a lead. The costs are not great. New Zealand needs to get on with it, show what can be done, and take a lead in the climate change space. This government, instead, is moving us backwards rapidly. It's costing $328 million with this legislation. It is looking to avoid, the latest reports say, future obligations in the way that very few countries did the first time round, and putting New Zealand really in a space where we will be less proud to call New Zealand home. So where we need to come back to is the kind of sensible SOP that stands in the name of Moana Maki, one which encourages New Zealand units to be traded, which New Zealand is the only country which currently does not place quantitative restrictions on international units. We need to step back into best practice and away from worst practice that this government seems to be attracted to. Let's do what the Australians are doing. The Australians are looking to do this. Many other schemes don't even allow any international units at all. So what we have here is a scheme that takes us backwards rapidly, that does away with that undermines the framework, and in fact gives greater confidence to polluters. This is not good enough. This is simply not good enough. We as a country need to be leading the charge and leading the technological development for addressing greenhouse gas emissions, because that is the way to future prosperity. New technologies developed and the IP that goes with them are what will lead the market and set the prices in future. That is both in the agricultural sector and across the energy sector and more broadly. So New Zealand needs those kinds of things. This government has the worst economic growth record in 50 years. There are other ways to sort that out other than rolling back what is already a very modest emissions trading scheme. We need tools to address the exchange rate, give the Reserve Bank those tools. We need better savings policies so that New Zealanders have money to invest in businesses. We need pro-growth tax reform that encourages money to go away from the speculative sector and towards the productive sector in our country. Those are the ways to support businesses in New Zealand. Watering down our climate change legislation is not the way to achieve economic growth in this country.
Honourable John Banks.
Mr Speaker, in a previous life I represented a